My mom told me you made us do this. I replied, you tried to steal my house. She didn't even deny forging my signature. She just called me dramatic, so I called the police on all of them. It never took me long to figure out where I stood in my family. My older brother Liam was the golden child. I was the backup plan, the afterthought, the kid who was expected to earn everything while he received it automatically. I'm not talking about little things like him getting the bigger slice of cake or staying up later than I could. I mean the kind of favoritism that shapes your entire childhood. If Liam failed, someone else was blamed. If I succeeded, I was told to try harder. My parents built their entire world around protecting him from consequences while expecting me to survive without help. Liam is 33, now married to his high school sweetheart Chloe, and they have 2 kids together. I'm 30. Looking back, I honestly think my parents decided who we were before either of us could even talk. Liam was the son who could do no wrong. I was the son who was supposed to quietly make sacrifices for everyone else. When Liam flunked out of an expensive private college because he spent more time drinking than attending classes, my parents blamed the professors for not understanding his learning style. They paid another year's tuition at a different university without hesitation. When he totaled his BMW after driving too fast during a rainstorm, they didn't make him pay a penny toward replacing it. They bought him another car within a week, because according to Mom, he'd already learned his lesson. Meanwhile, I had to maintain nearly perfect grades just to hear Dad mutter good job without looking up from the television. A single B meant an hour-long lecture about discipline and wasted potential. Even relatives noticed the difference. At family holidays, my aunts would joke that Liam could rob a bank and still be Mom's favorite. Mom always laughed a little too loudly before insisting everyone was exaggerating. Then she'd somehow twist the conversation until I was apologizing for causing tension. After enough years, I stopped expecting fairness. I simply accepted that I was playing a completely different game than my brother. College was the first time I truly understood how different our lives were. My parents paid almost every expense Liam had. They covered tuition, rent, books, spending money, and even spring break trips. I paid my own way through scholarships, federal loans, and 3 part-time jobs. There were semesters when I slept 4 hours a night because I'd close the library after studying work, an overnight warehouse shift, attend morning classes, then tutor freshmen in the afternoon before starting over again. It wasn't glamorous, but every paycheck brought me one step closer to independence. When I graduated, nobody threw me a celebration. Dad shook my hand. Mom hugged me and immediately asked whether I'd found a real job yet. A month later, Liam announced his engagement to Chloe. My parents hosted a huge backyard party with catered food, live music, and enough decorations to rival a wedding reception. I wasn't jealous anymore. I was just used to it. After graduation, I landed an accounting job that paid reasonably well, but demanded ridiculous hours. 60-hour work weeks became normal during a tax season. My apartment was tiny. The plumbing barely worked, and my 2 roommates argued almost every night over dishes and utility bills. Still, I had a plan. I wanted to own a house before I turned 30. Not because I cared about impressing anyone, but because I wanted something that belonged entirely to me. So I cut every unnecessary expense. I drove the same beat-up Honda Civic I'd owned since college. I packed peanut butter sandwiches for lunch instead of eating out with coworkers. I skipped vacations, birthdays, concerts, and weekends away. Friends eventually stopped inviting me because they already knew I'd say no. Dating was impossible because every extra dollar went straight into saving. My coworkers joked that I was the cheapest accountant they'd ever met. They weren't wrong. For 3 years, my entire life revolved around one goal. Eventually, that sacrifice paid off. At 27, I found exactly what I'd been looking for. It wasn't some luxury property with marble floors and a swimming pool. It was a modest 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in a quiet neighborhood. The previous owners had maintained it beautifully. It needed fresh paint, updated fixtures, and some landscaping, but structurally, it was solid. The backyard was fenced, the roof was only a few years old, and the mortgage fit comfortably within my budget. During the 6-week closing process, I asked my parents if they wanted to come see it. Mom said she was busy. Dad told me buying a house was financially irresponsible because everything eventually breaks. Neither of them visited until a month after I moved in. Even then, they didn't congratulate me. Dad immediately pointed out a tiny crack near one window and suggested the foundation might be shifting. Mom asked when I planned to buy a proper guest bed so Liam's family could stay over. Liam walked through the living room, looked around for a few seconds, smirked, and said, "It's cozy." Anyone who's ever heard that word delivered with just the right amount of condescension knows exactly what he meant. I smiled anyway. It didn't matter. The house was mine. My name was on the deed. Every wall represented years of sacrifice nobody else had made. Every weekend became another home improvement project. I painted every room myself. I replaced old light fixtures after watching YouTube tutorials. I learned basic plumbing to install a new garbage disposal. Last summer, I even built a wooden deck in the backyard, measuring and cutting every board myself. For the first time in my life, I had something nobody could take credit for except me. While I was slowly improving my little house, Liam and Chloe were doing the exact opposite. They bought a 5-bedroom home in one of Denver's expensive suburbs that was far beyond what they could realistically afford. Their mortgage alone made me nervous. Add 2 luxury SUVs, private preschool tuition, expensive vacations, and constant home renovations, and it became obvious they were living paycheck to paycheck. But appearances mattered more than reality. Their social media pages looked like a home design magazine. Every weekend featured another catered barbecue, another designer furniture delivery, another smiling family photo. Behind the scenes, my parents quietly financed the illusion. They paid insurance bills, covered missed mortgage payments, bought groceries, and transferred thousands of dollars whenever Liam hit a rough patch. Whenever I questioned it, Mom always gave the same answer. They have children. They need help. Apparently, needing help only applied to Liam. When I got promoted to senior accountant after years of overtime, nobody mentioned it during Sunday dinner. Conversation revolved around Liam interviewing for a management position and my niece starting dance classes. I had remodeled my kitchen cabinets by hand that month. Nobody even asked how the house was coming along. Eventually, I stopped volunteering information about my own life because it disappeared into silence anyway. Then everything changed almost overnight. Liam lost his job. Officially, his company blamed restructuring. Unofficially, a mutual acquaintance told me Liam had missed sales targets for months and repeatedly violated company expense policies. Whatever the truth was, the paycheck disappeared. 3 missed mortgage payments quickly turned into foreclosure notices. My parents emptied their savings trying to keep him afloat, but even they couldn't sustain his lifestyle forever. Selling the house would have solved most of the problem, but Liam and Chloe refused. Downsizing, according to Chloe, would send the wrong message. Instead, they kept waiting for a miracle. Fortunately for me, my parents decided I was supposed to be that miracle. About 2 months ago, Mom invited me to dinner on a Tuesday night. That immediately felt strange because we normally gathered only every few weeks. It felt even stranger when I walked inside and found my favorite homemade baked ziti waiting on the table. Mom only made my favorite meal when she wanted something. Dad greeted me with a smile, offered me a beer, and actually asked about work. Liam and Chloe arrived 20 minutes later looking exhausted, but trying to pretend everything was fine. Halfway through dinner, Dad quietly put down his fork, folded his hands on the table, looked directly at me and said, "Since Liam has a wife and 2 children and you're living alone in a 3-bedroom house, we think it makes the most sense if you give him your house." For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. I stared across the table waiting for someone to laugh, tell me it was a joke or admit they were filming some terrible prank. Nobody smiled. Mom reached over and gently patted my hand as if she were explaining something to a child. "Honey," she said softly, "you have a wonderful job. You're single. You don't need all that space. Liam has a family to think about. Those children deserve stability." I slowly pulled my hand away. "You're asking me to give him my house." Dad shrugged. "Not permanently. We can work out the paperwork later. Think of it as helping family." "The paperwork," I repeated. "The deed is in my name." "Details," Mom said dismissively. "You're young enough to buy another place in a few years." I looked toward Liam, hoping for even the slightest sign that he was embarrassed by what was happening. Instead, he kept staring at his plate while Chloe rubbed circles on his back like he was the victim. "Say something," I told him. He finally looked up. "We're in a bad spot, man. It's only until I get it back on my feet. You bought a house you couldn't afford." Chloe immediately jumped in. "Nobody could have predicted the layoffs." "No," I replied calmly. "But plenty of people could have predicted that buying a 5-bedroom house with almost no savings was a terrible financial decision." Dad slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. This isn't about blame. It's about solving the problem. Then sell their house." Silent. "Excuse me," Mom asked. "Sell it? Downsize? Buy something they can actually afford?" Chloe's face twisted in disgust. "We're not moving into some tiny starter home. Then that's your choice." Mom leaned forward, her expression hardening. "You're being unbelievably selfish." I almost laughed. "Selfish? I spent years saving for this house while Liam spent years pretending he was rich." Dad pointed a finger at me. "Watch your attitude." "No. I've watched my attitude for 30 years. It's someone else's turn." I stood up, pushing my chair back. "The answer is no." The room instantly became ice cold. Mom's fake warmth disappeared so quickly it was almost unsettling. She folded her hands neatly in front of her and looked directly into my eyes. "We'll find another way." The words weren't loud. They weren't emotional. They were calm, almost casual. Somehow that made them far more unsettling. "What does that mean?" I asked. Dad waved dismissively. "Forget it. Go home and think about it." "I've already thought about it." I grabbed my jacket. "Nobody is getting my house." Liam finally spoke again as I reached the front door. "You're really choosing a building over your family?" I turned back toward him. "No, I'm choosing not to reward years of terrible decisions." Then I walked out. The entire drive home, Mom's words echoed through my head. "We'll find another way." I tried convincing myself she was simply being manipulative the same way she'd always used guilt to get what she wanted. Even so, something felt wrong. The next morning, I called my best friend Marcus and told him everything. After a long silence, he said exactly one sentence. "Change every lock today." I laughed at first. "You think they're going to break into my house? I think your parents have spent 30 years proving they don't believe normal boundaries apply to them." That sentence stayed with me. After work, I stopped at Home Depot, bought new deadbolts for every exterior door, and spent the evening replacing every lock. I felt ridiculous while doing it. They were my parents. Surely I was overreacting. A week later, I discovered I hadn't been paranoid enough. It was a Tuesday morning at work. I was halfway through reviewing a client's quarterly tax filings when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my bank Banks almost never call unless something is seriously wrong. I stepped into the hallway and answered. Mr. Carter? The woman asked politely. This is Melissa from the mortgage processing department. I'm calling to verify some information regarding your refinance application. I stopped walking. There was a brief pause. Your refinance application, sir. It was submitted this morning requesting a cash-out refinance on your property. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I never submitted any refinance application. Melissa's tone immediately changed. Would you be able to come into the branch today? I'm leaving now. I didn't even return to my desk. I texted my manager that I had a family emergency, grabbed my keys, and drove straight downtown. A senior loan officer named David met me in a private office. Without saying much, he turned his monitor toward me. My stomach dropped. There was my mortgage, my address, my social security number, my employment information, my salary. Every detail was accurate. Then I noticed the section labeled Ownership Structure. The refinance requested that my parents be added as equal co-owners of my property. My hands actually started shaking. I whispered. This isn't possible. David zoomed in on the uploaded documents. Our fraud detection system flagged several inconsistencies before anything could move forward. I barely heard him. I was staring at the electronic signature. It looked like mine at first glance, but the longer I looked, the more obvious it became. Someone had copied it, poorly. I recognized the looping handwriting immediately. My mother. She'd practiced my signature using old documents until she thought it looked convincing. David pointed to the reasons the application had been flagged. An outdated email address, a phone number that no longer belonged to me, signature irregularities, an IP address from a different part of the city. If the system hadn't flagged it, he admitted quietly, it likely would have continued through processing until final verification. I felt sick. They hadn't been bluffing. They'd actually tried to take my house. I need copies of everything I said. David nodded. Already printing. He also immediately froze my mortgage account, added multiple fraud alerts, and documented that I had denied authorizing the application. While the printer hummed in the corner, I pulled out my phone. David looked at me cautiously. Who are you calling the person who forged my signature? Mom answered on the second ring. Hello, sweetheart. Have you finally decided to... You tried to steal my house? Silence. I expected denial. Instead, she sighed. Don't be so dramatic. I stared at the phone in disbelief. The bank called me. We were only trying to speed things up. David slowly looked away, pretending not to listen. Speed up what I asked. The process you refused to cooperate with, she replied. Liam doesn't have time to wait for you to stop being selfish. You forged legal documents. If you had agreed to help your brother, none of this would have been necessary. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't denying anything. She genuinely believed their actions were justified. I'm reporting this to the police. Her voice instantly turned cold. You wouldn't do that to your own family. Watch me. We gave you everything. I laughed bitterly. No, you gave everything to Liam. Then I hung up. David sat silently for several seconds before sliding a business card across the desk. This is the direct number for our fraud investigator. I also recommend contacting an attorney immediately. I nodded. I already know who I'm calling. Marcus's cousin Julian specialized in financial fraud litigation. He agreed to see me the very next morning. By the time I walked out of the bank carrying a folder full of forged documents, I realized something that hurt almost as much as the fraud itself. My parents hadn't made a desperate mistake. They had carefully planned this. They had gathered my personal information, copied my signature, completed legal paperwork, and submitted it without a second thought. They hadn't simply chosen Liam over me this time. They had decided that everything I'd spent years building belonged to him anyway. As I reached my car, my phone began exploding with calls from Mom, Dad, Liam, and Chloe. I looked at the screen for a few seconds, switched the phone to airplane mode, and drove straight toward Julian's office. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to save my family. I was trying to protect myself from them. Julian spent almost 2 hours reviewing every document the bank had printed for me. He barely interrupted while I explained what had happened over the past week, from the bizarre dinner conversation to my mother's phone confession. Every few minutes, he would make another note, circle another paragraph, or ask for an exact date. When I finally finished, he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. First, he said, "You need to understand something. Your parents didn't almost make a bad decision. They allegedly committed multiple crimes. Attempted mortgage fraud, forgery, identity theft, and possibly conspiracy. The fact that the bank stopped the application doesn't erase what they attempted." Hearing someone else say it out loud made everything feel frighteningly real. Up until then, part of me had still hoped there was some explanation I hadn't considered. Maybe desperation had clouded their judgment. Maybe they'd believed they were only bending the rules. Julian destroyed that illusion in less than a minute. This wasn't impulsive, he continued. Someone gathered your financial information, completed legal paperwork, forged signatures, and submitted everything electronically. That takes planning. I slowly nodded. What do I do now? We start protecting you. Before I left his office, we had a detailed plan. File a police report immediately. Freeze my credit with every major bureau. Request complete credit histories. Notify the IRS that my identity may have been compromised. Preserve every text, voicemail, email, and piece of physical evidence. Most importantly, stop communicating directly with my parents unless absolutely necessary. People who believe they're entitled to your property rarely stop after the first failed attempt, Julian warned. I wished he had been wrong. The following morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper and immediately knew something had happened. The smell hit me before I even reached the driveway. Rotten eggs. My freshly painted front door was covered in dried yolk. The garage door looked even worse. My mailbox porch windows and the hood of my Honda Civic had all been hit repeatedly. Under the summer sun, the egg had already hardened into a sticky crust that would permanently damage the paint if it wasn't cleaned quickly. For a moment, I just stood there staring. It wasn't about the mess. It was about what it represented. Someone had driven to my house at 2 in the morning just to punish me for refusing to surrender my home. Then I remembered the security cameras I'd installed after changing the locks. I went back inside and opened the footage. At exactly 2:07 a.m., Liam and Chloe walked into frame carrying grocery bags filled with egg cartons. They laughed while throwing dozens of eggs across my property. My mother stood on the sidewalk with her arms folded, occasionally pointing toward another section of the house they hadn't hit yet. Dad never got out of the SUV. He simply waited at the curb until everyone climbed back inside before driving away. I watched the recording twice because I honestly couldn't believe what I was seeing. These weren't angry teenagers. These were adults in their 30s encouraged by two people in their late 50s and early 60s. I called the police. The responding officers photographed everything, watched the security footage, and took copies of the video. One of them looked genuinely stunned. Family dispute, he asked? I nodded. They tried to transfer my house into their names last week. He looked back at the footage. That certainly gives this some context. The cleanup alone cost nearly $300 after I hired a pressure washing company and a mobile detailer for my car. I saved every receipt. Julian had told me to document absolutely everything. Later that afternoon, I forwarded the police report, photographs, receipts, and security footage to his office. He called me within the hour. This helps, he said. Not because I wanted this to happen, but because judges take ongoing harassment very seriously. I'm filing for an emergency restraining order. That night, Marcus insisted I stay at his apartment. Your family is acting like people who've convinced themselves they're the victims, he said. That's when they become unpredictable. I reluctantly agreed. We ordered pizza, watched an old action movie, and deliberately avoided talking about my parents. It was the first normal evening I'd had in weeks. The next morning, I returned home expecting more vandalism. Instead, I found a large manila envelope pushed underneath my front door. There was no stamp or return address. My name had been written neatly across the front in my mother's handwriting. My stomach immediately tightened. Inside were psychiatric records from when I was 15 years old. I remembered that period clearly. Like a lot of teenagers, I'd argued with my parents, skipped class a couple of times, gotten caught smoking marijuana once behind the football field, and generally acted like an immature kid. My parents reacted as though I had become a violent criminal. They forced me into therapy with a psychiatrist who seemed more interested in agreeing with whatever they said than listening to me. Reading those reports as an adult was surreal. They described me as manipulative, unstable, and prone to dangerous behavior. Every serious allegation came directly from my parents' descriptions. Taped to the front was a yellow sticky note. Remember who you really are. Drop this nonsense before everyone finds out, especially your employer. I read it 3 times before it truly registered. They were trying to blackmail me. They wanted me to believe they'd send confidential psychiatric records to my accounting firm unless I abandoned the case. I photographed everything before driving straight to Julian's office. He read the note once, then placed it carefully into an evidence folder. Congratulations, he said. I stared at him. Congratulations, you now have documented witness intimidation and attempted extortion. That's not exactly how I would have described today. He smiled sympathetically. I know, but from a legal standpoint, they just made our case much stronger. Before I left, Julian mentioned something else. My investigator has been digging into your parents' finances. There are several things that don't add up. The following morning, he called and asked me to come in immediately. When I arrived, a thick red folder waited on his desk. We pulled background records, he said. Standard procedure. I opened the folder and immediately froze. Court records, criminal filings, financial judgments. Your father, Julian explained, was investigated years ago for tax fraud involving a fake contracting business. He eventually accepted a plea agreement. He turned another page. Your mother was charged separately with identity theft after opening financial accounts using other people's personal information. I looked up in disbelief. You're telling me they've done this before? Julian nodded. Not exactly this, but enough to establish a pattern. Suddenly, my entire childhood started making sense. The unexplained financial problems, the periods when money seemed to disappear, the constant secrecy around bills, even their obsession with controlling family finances. There's more, Julian continued. He slid another report toward me. Your parents are carrying roughly $350,000 in unsecured debt. I stared at the number. It couldn't be real. My parents drove luxury vehicles, took cruises every year, and constantly criticized anyone who lived beyond their means. Most of this debt appears to have accumulated while supporting Liam's lifestyle, Julian explained. Mortgage assistance, vehicle payments, credit cards, personal loans. Some of the lenders aren't traditional financial institutions. Loan sharks, I asked quietly. Possibly. I leaned back completely overwhelmed. Suddenly, the bizarre dinner invitation made perfect sense. My parents weren't simply trying to rescue Liam. They were drowning themselves. My house wasn't just a convenient solution. It was the last valuable asset they believed they could still reach. Julian tapped one final document. Unfortunately, I don't think this is the first time they've used your identity. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? He turned the page toward me. We found evidence of a defaulted personal loan opened 7 years ago under your name. I stared at the application. Every piece of identifying information belonged to me. The mailing address belonged to my parents. Seeing my own name on that loan agreement felt worse than discovering the forged mortgage paperwork. The refinance had been a recent attack. This meant they had been using my identity for years without my knowledge. 7 years earlier, I had been 22, fresh out of college, working my first accounting job, living with roommates in a rundown apartment, and stretching every paycheck just to cover rent and student loans. While I was clipping grocery coupons and eating rice beans and peanut butter sandwiches to stay afloat, someone had quietly taken out a personal loan using my social security number. Can we prove it, I asked? Julian nodded. We've already subpoenaed the original application. We'll get the handwritten signatures supporting identification, IP logs, and payment history. Given the mailing address and everything else we've uncovered, I'm confident we'll know exactly who submitted it. I sat there in stunned silence. Suddenly, every inexplicable credit issue I'd experienced during my 20s came rushing back. Higher than expected interest rates, credit applications that took longer than they should have, a credit card denial I'd blamed on my student loans. I'd always assumed I simply hadn't built enough credit history. Now I wondered how much damage had been done behind my back. Julian wasn't finished. Until we receive complete reports, assume there could be more. That sentence stayed with me for the rest of the day. We immediately froze my credit with every bureau filed expanded identity theft reports, notified the IRS, and requested 10 years of financial history from every institution connected to my record. By the time I left his office, I felt emotionally exhausted. The parents who had lectured me my entire life about responsibility had secretly sabotaged my financial future while pretending to teach me discipline. Marcus met me outside my house that evening carrying 2 pizzas and enough junk food to stock a convenience store. You look terrible, he said. I feel worse. We sat on my half-finished backyard deck until sunset, talking about anything except my family. Sports, movies, work, old college memory. For a couple of hours, I almost forgot everything that was happening. Before leaving, Marcus stopped beside his truck. Whatever happens, he said, don't let them convince you this is your fault. I promised I wouldn't, although I wasn't completely sure I believed it yet. Years of emotional manipulation don't disappear overnight. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed. The screen showed Liam's name. I almost ignored it before noticing it wasn't a call. It was a text. Please meet me tomorrow. Main Street Diner, 10 a.m. Just us. No mom or dad. It's important. I stared at it for several minutes. Part of me assumed it was another trap. Another part wondered whether he had finally realized how badly everything had spiraled out of control. I forwarded the message to Julian before replying with a single word. Fine. The next morning, I arrived 5 minutes early and chose a booth near the front windows. Liam walked in exactly at 10. For the first time in years, he looked nothing like the confident golden child I had grown up envying. His expensive haircut was overdue. His clothes were wrinkled. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. He looked older than 33. He sat down without saying anything. A waitress poured coffee into both mugs before leaving us alone. Finally, he spoke. I'm sorry. I waited. I know that doesn't fix anything. No, I agreed. It doesn't. He nodded slowly. I deserve that. Another silence settled over the table. Did you know? I finally asked. About the refinance. He rubbed both hands across his face. Not at first. Don't lie to me. I'm not. He looked directly at me for the first time. Mom and Dad said they had another plan after you refused to help. I honestly thought they meant they'd keep trying to convince you. I didn't know they were using your identity until after the bank rejected everything. I studied him carefully. He looked ashamed, but after everything that had happened, shame alone wasn't enough. You still helped vandalize my house. He lowered his eyes. Yeah, you still let them pressure me. Yeah, you never once stood up for me. I know. There were no excuses, no blaming anyone else, just quiet admissions. Why are we here? I finally asked. Liam took a long breath before answering. Because this has gone way beyond me losing my house. He leaned forward and lowered his voice. Mom and Dad are in serious trouble. I almost laughed. I've noticed. No, you haven't. He looked toward the front door to make sure nobody was listening. They're getting visits. Visits from the people they borrowed money from. I immediately thought of Julian mentioning unlicensed lenders. Loan sharks. Liam nodded once. Dad didn't tell me everything until a few nights ago. He thought he could keep borrowing until things turned around. Borrowing for what? Liam hesitated. It wasn't just helping me. My stomach tightened. Then what? He looked embarrassed. Gambling. I stared at him. Dad started betting on sports after he retired. Small amounts at first, then bigger ones. Every time he lost, he borrowed more trying to win it back. Suddenly everything fit together. The hidden debt, the second mortgages, the desperate attempt to steal my house. It had never been solely about rescuing Liam. They were trying to save themselves from financial collapse. Mom knew I asked. Eventually. And she still helped. He nodded miserably. She kept believing one big win would fix everything. I shook my head in disbelief. The people who had spent decades preaching responsibility had secretly destroyed their own lives chasing losses. Liam reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small USB flash drive on the table. What's this? Recordings? I frowned. Of what arguments? He pushed the drive toward me. After everything started falling apart, I began recording conversations because Mom and Dad kept changing their stories. A few nights ago, they admitted almost everything. I didn't touch it. Everything Dad admitted using your identity years ago because you had good credit and would never notice. My chest tightened. Mom admitted copying your signature on the refinance paperwork. He swallowed hard. She also admitted mailing those psychiatric records because she thought your job mattered more to you than taking them to court. I stared at the flash drive without moving. Why give this to me? Liam's eyes filled with tears. Because I'm done. His voice cracked. I've spent my whole life letting them fix every mistake I made. Every time something went wrong, they bailed me out instead of making me grow up. I thought they loved me more than you. Maybe they did. But this isn't love anymore. It's obsession. He looked completely defeated. They've destroyed themselves trying to protect me from consequences. Now they're destroying you too. For the first time in our lives, I believed he understood what I'd been living with since childhood. Not because someone explained it to him, but because the same people who had always protected him had finally started consuming him as well. I picked up the flash drive and slipped it into my pocket. If this contains what you say it does, I said quietly, there's no going back. Liam nodded. I know. He stood up, left enough cash on the table to cover both coffees and paused beside the booth. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just don't want my kids growing up thinking this is what family looks like. Then he walked out of the diner. I watched him leave before pulling out my phone and calling Julian. I think I said as soon as he answered, we just got the evidence that finishes this case. Julian asked me not to listen to the recordings until I reached his office. If they're genuine, he explained over the phone, I want them preserved exactly as they were received. Within an hour, I was sitting across from him while his investigator copied the contents of the flash drive onto a secured computer. There were 8 audio files. None lasted more than 15 minutes. By the time we finished listening to the second one, nobody in the room said another word. My father's voice clearly admitted using my social security number years earlier because, as he put it, his credit was clean and he never checked it. My mother calmly described practicing my signature until she thought it looked convincing enough to fool the bank. Another recording captured both of them discussing the psychiatric records they'd mailed me. Mom actually laughed while saying, he cares too much about that accounting job. Once HR sees those papers, he'll drop the lawsuit. The final recording was somehow the worst. Dad blamed me for everything. If he'd just signed the house over when we asked, none of this would have happened. There it was. No regret, no apology. Just complete certainty that I was responsible for the consequences of crimes they had chosen to commit. Julian stopped the recording and looked at me. This changes everything. Good or bad, I asked. Good for your case, he answered carefully. Terrible for your parents. Over the next several weeks, everything moved surprisingly quickly. The bank formally referred the mortgage application to federal investigators because forged financial documents had been submitted electronically. Local detectives expanded their investigation after receiving the recordings, the security footage, the threatening note, and the forged paperwork. The district attorney's office combined everything into a single case involving attempted mortgage fraud, identity theft, forgery, attempted theft by deception, witness, intimidation, extortion, and vandalism. My restraining order was granted without opposition after the judge reviewed the evidence. Neither parent was allowed to contact me directly. Every future communication had to go through attorneys. For the first time in months, I slept through an entire night. It didn't last long. About 3 weeks later, I received another call from Julian. We got the subpoena responses from the old personal loan. I drove to his office expecting another unpleasant surprise. Instead, he handed me the original paperwork. The signature wasn't mine. It wasn't even close. The surveillance photo taken inside the lending office showed my mother sitting across from the loan officer wearing sunglasses and using my driver's license information. Security footage had been retained because the loan had eventually defaulted. The employee processing the application later confirmed that my mother claimed she was helping her busy son complete paperwork because I was supposedly working out of state. The investigator looked at me and simply said, "We've seen this trick before." That single fraudulent loan explained years of mysterious credit problems. Fortunately, because investigators confirmed it had been opened through identity theft, the lender agreed to remove it from my credit history entirely. Over the following month, several smaller fraudulent accounts surfaced as well. A department store credit card, a line of credit that had never been activated, an unpaid utility account registered under my name at one of Liam's previous addresses. Piece by piece, everything was disputed and removed. It felt strange watching my own financial history slowly become accurate for the first time in years. Liam cooperated fully with investigators. He turned over additional emails, text messages, and financial records that confirmed my parents had orchestrated nearly everything themselves. His attorney negotiated a favorable agreement because he had voluntarily provided evidence before charges were filed against him for the vandalism. He accepted responsibility, paid restitution for the property damage, completed community service, and entered counseling. We weren't suddenly best friends. Too much had happened for that. But for the first time in our lives, we spoke honestly. A few months later, he called simply to apologize again. This time, there were no excuses, no explanations, and no requests for forgiveness. Just an apology. It didn't erase 30 years, but it mattered. My parents never apologized at all. Even after overwhelming evidence piled up against them, they insisted everyone else had misunderstood their intentions. During one hearing, my father actually argued that parents should have the right to make financial decisions for their children when it's in the family's best interest. The judge was visibly unimpressed. Rather than risk a lengthy trial with recordings, financial records, bank employees, investigators, and digital evidence all prepared to testify, both of my parents eventually accepted plea agreements. They pleaded guilty to multiple felony offenses, agreed to substantial restitution, permanently lost access to numerous financial services, and received prison sentences, followed by supervised release. Watching the hearing felt strangely empty. For years, I had imagined that exposing the truth would somehow feel satisfying. Instead, I mostly felt tired. The people sitting at the defense table barely resembled the parents I remembered. Their arrogance had finally collapsed under the weight of reality. After the sentencing, Mom looked back at me exactly once. I expected anger, maybe tears. Instead, she looked confused, as though she genuinely couldn't understand why I hadn't sacrificed everything to save them. That expression stayed with me longer than anything else. It reminded me that some people never accept responsibility, because doing so would require admitting they've been wrong their entire lives. Several months later, my credit had been fully restored. My mortgage remained exactly as I'd signed it years earlier. The fraudulent refinance was permanently erased. The restraining order stayed in place. I quietly returned to work, where my manager simply welcomed me back and never once asked about the psychiatric records that my parents had threatened to send. They never followed through. Even if they had, it wouldn't have mattered. Julian had already informed my employer that I was the victim of an active criminal extortion case. One Saturday morning, I finally finished building the backyard deck I'd abandoned when all of this started. As I tightened the last bolt into place, Marcus walked through the gate carrying a cooler full of drinks. He looked around at the completed deck, the freshly painted fence, and the flower beds I'd finally had time to plant. "Looks like home," he said. I smiled. It always was. We spent the afternoon grilling burgers and talking about anything except lawsuits and court dates. The silence felt peaceful instead of tense. Before leaving, Marcus looked around the yard again. "You know," he said, "for years you kept saying you wished your family would finally appreciate everything you'd built." I nodded. Now I looked at the house I'd worked so hard to buy, the deck I'd built with my own hands, and the life I'd protected despite everything thrown at me. Now I realized I was asking the wrong people. Losing my parents hurt more than I expected, even after everything they had done. But eventually I understood something important. I hadn't destroyed my family by refusing to give away my house. They destroyed it the moment they decided my hard work belonged to someone else. I didn't lose a home during this nightmare. I kept it. What I lost was the illusion that blood alone makes people family. And looking back now, that's probably the most valuable thing I walked away with.